Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for attending what promises to be a fascinating evening of blood, bones, crime and suspense. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to chair this discussion. I'm very honoured to be part of such a prestigious event. My name is Dr. Anna Williams. I'm a forensic anthropologist, and I'm currently head of the Centre for Forensic Anthropology Research at Cranfield University. This panel discussion is part of the Royal Society's annual Summer Science Exhibition, which showcases the most exciting cutting-edge science and technology research. It's a wonderful opportunity for members of the public, teachers and students to get more involved with all aspects of science and interact directly with scientists. Firstly, some brief housekeeping notes. May I politely ask everybody to make sure that their mobiles are either switched off or put to silent. And the event is being recorded for the Society's archives and will be made available on demand on the Society's website, so please no bad language. In a case of an emergency, the exits are signposted. There's one there and there's one there, doing my air hostess bit. And as far as I know, we're not expecting a fire drill, so if the fire alarm does sound, it's a real fire. And please leave in an orderly manner, calmly and collectively. And the toilets are situated just out here. Okay. Since starting my career as a forensic anthropologist, shockingly some 15 years ago now, I've seen the public attitude to forensic science change dramatically. When I went into it, it was certainly seen as a bit of an unusual career and an unusual choice, especially for a young woman, and it seemed a bit of an old boys' club. And now, in contrast, our popular culture is flooded with forensic scientists and crime scene investigators, and forensic science has become the career of choice for many young people, and interestingly, for more women than for men now. There have been amazing developments in forensic science techniques over the last 30 years, such as advancements in DNA profiling, which have changed the judicial system forever. These improvements have led to forensic science being viewed by juries and by the public as almost infallible, and as experts as quasi-superheroes, gleaning information from tiny pieces of trace evidence. This view of forensic science makes it intoxicating and fascinating for many, and has led to a huge surge in novels and TV shows based around crack teams of forensic scientists. It could now be argued that forensic science has become a victim of its own success, with public expectation of its capability reaching its peak. We will be discussing the recent improvements in forensic science techniques and our growing fascination with the subject, any pitfalls of its success, and the transferal of science from the labs to the TV screens. We've got a packed evening of talks and discussion for you tonight. I would say that first the panelists are going to talk, and then we will discuss amongst ourselves some of the key points that we've raised, and then if there are lots of questions, we will open it up to the floor. We will kick off with Hayley Jackson-Smith. She's a forensic scientist from the London Metropolitan Evidence Recovery Unit. She will introduce how the Met deal with serious crimes and the techniques she uses to analyse crime scenes. She will set the scene for the introduction of the other experts. Then we will hear from Dr Paul Debenham, who is the Director of Innovation and Development at LGC, the UK's National Measurement Institute for Chemical and Biochemical Analysis, and he will discuss DNA evidence and the use of DNA profiling. After him, we will hear from Clea Koff, a forensic anthropologist and author who has worked for the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and worked in Bosnia, Croatia, and Serbia. And then our final speaker is the crime writer Val McDermid, perhaps best known for her suspense novels that are the basis of the TV series Wire in the Blood. So I shall hand over to Hayley Jackson-Smith.
Hi, as Anna, sorry, wow, microphone. As Anna said, my name's Hayley Jackson-Smith, and I'm a forensic scientist for the London Metropolitan Police Evidence Recovery Unit. What I thought I'd do is just let you know what a forensic scientist does, because, as I'm sure you're aware, what you see in the media isn't always entirely true. I'm sure we'll debate that a bit later on. And from that as well, I want to tell you what scientific techniques we can bring to a crime scene. And hopefully that'll inspire a lot more people to start doing all those science and mathematics subjects that we were hearing about in the media earlier today. Okay, so what does a forensic scientist do? This slide aims to show where the forensic scientist actually sits in the Metropolitan Police investigation of crime. So what actually happens when that 999 call comes in is that it's responded to by a normal police officer. That police officer, once he gets there with his colleague, if he's working in pairs, will assess the scene and decide whether or not it's serious. If it's a serious crime, he'll put a call in, and a homicide assessment team will arrive. And they travel around in what they call hat cars, pan-London. A homicide assessment team consists of a group of detectives and detective sergeants, and what they will do is decide whether a serious crime has been committed. Once that's occurred and they've decided it's a homicide or an attempted murder or something requiring a crime scene manager, then they'll put the call into their senior officer, and he will coordinate with a central system, and a crime scene manager will be sent to that crime. The crime scene manager oversees the entire forensic strategy for that particular offence. So he'll be setting the strategy and coordinating everything else that happens in a forensic context at that scene. It's really at that stage that a forensic scientist will be involved. That crime scene manager will decide which experts he needs. So, for example, if it's raining, he'll be calling in for tents. He'll be setting the cordons. He'll be extending them if necessary. And he'll be deciding whether he needs a forensic scientist, a forensic anthropologist, an entomologist, someone who studies insects. He'll be making those decisions. So he's decided he needs a forensic scientist. So he will call my unit, and one of us, whoever's on call, will respond. Okay, so once we've been to the crime scene and assessed what needs to be done, we'll agree a strategy with the crime scene manager, and from there we'll take exhibits, whether that's samples or actual items, and we'll do a host of other things which I'll come to. And then from there, anything that needs extra analysis gets sent to an external forensic provider, for example, LGC, which is where Paul will be talking more about that a bit later on. So hopefully that just is a lot of information to take on board, but hopefully you can see how it's coordinated in a way that includes the police structure, and then the scientist, and then the external forensic provider. So it's not quite CSI, where one person rocks up and interviews the suspect and then takes a swab, and nothing that there's wrong. Not there's anything wrong with fiction. So, okay. So a few of the forensic science techniques that we can bring to a crime scene are displayed up here. There's quite a lot of information on that slide as well, so I'm not expecting everyone to take it all in. But you can see that what we do is real science. We use Eppendorfs that change color and chemicals, and yeah, it's real science that we apply to a crime scene. It's not just sort of dusting and powdering and collecting. It's using a lot of the time state-of-the-art techniques and equipment to make the best of that crime scene and take the exhibits that we need to do. Okay, so this slide is to show you, or what you should be struggling to see, is a shoe mark in blood on quite a complicated background. So there's a number of methods that we can use to try and enhance that shoe mark, because obviously it's massively evidentially important. You've got someone here who's stepped in blood at a crime scene and then left an impression. So nobody floats in and out of a crime scene, so shoe marks are very important at crime scenes. It's one of the first things that we do when we get to a scene. So you can use a lot of light sources to try and visualize a mark like this, and you can use chemicals as well. What I just want to show you is something that I'm just blown away by, is if you shine a UV light of a certain wavelength onto this floor, you get this. So I mean, that's no chemistry involved. It's just using a different light source. As you see, it's pretty impressive. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to just bring up is luminol, because it's everywhere, isn't it? CSI love luminol. I think they call it Blue Star, which is a luminol competitor. But we use luminol mostly because it's cheap and it's effective. So what we have here is, I wish I'd actually put the other one on, because you'd see that you can see that it's blood-stained without the luminol, but you can't see any detail. You can't see what's going on here at all. So what we do is we black out the entire room, very low-tech, just putting bits of black sheet up over the windows, so you're working in near complete darkness. And then you spray this chemical that reacts with the blood, and in the darkened environment, by a process called chemoluminescence, you get this bright blue glow where the blood is. We can talk more about how that works if you're interested later on. But what you can see here is that you've got an actual shoe mark in the center of the bed. Now, in this particular case, it was very important because it looked like somebody had actually ransacked the room whilst beating somebody, so that you had somebody with bleeding injuries, and then you had movement around the crime scene. So this shoe mark in blood, previously invisible, is now visible. And we actually got the suspect in this case. And I think even a layman can see that you've got some of the detail in the center of that shoe coming out in the luminol mark. And that was actually enough, that shoe mark, to allow for a comparison between the two, which strengthened the evidence against the suspect. So yay for luminol. Okay. This is another aspect that I wanted to bring out. Just, I don't know if anyone's seen Dexter. Yeah. So bloodstain pattern analysis. It is true, we do use bloodstain pattern analysis, not quite entirely the way that he shows you it being done, but things like stringing, where you attach strings to the center of a bloodstain and bring it back to a certain point to show where that point of impact was. That's true, we do use that. It's used quite frequently in crime scenes. I think bloodstain pattern analysis is probably best explained with the image on the probably the left as you look at it. What you've got there is a knife with blood dripping down and forming a blood stain at the bottom there. A couple of things to point out is that when blood drips, it doesn't sort of fall in a tear shape. You know, you see in all the sort of animated cartoons and things that it's like tears. That doesn't actually happen because we've got scientific forces working on this blood drop as it falls. It oscillates, it goes oval and spherical like this, but it never forms that tear shape that you see because the cohesive forces of blood attracting each other hold it together. And then with gravity, it falls down, and then when it hits the flat surface, you get a circular stain. So you know a stain like this was dropped from something that was at 90 degrees to it. If you get slightly different shaped stains, then you know that the angle of impact is different. And that's the sort of thing that you're looking at with bloodstain pattern analysis. The other thing, just quickly down the bottom, is arterial spatter. What you see here is a projected stain, which has come from somebody with a severed artery. And what happens is that you get a characteristic wave shape of high-volume bloodstains. And the wave shape is actually with the beat of the heart. So as the heart's beating, blood comes out like that. It's a bit, I don't know, macabre, but it's something that we use to show that somebody has actually had a severed artery there, which if you don't have a body at a crime scene can be of vital importance. You know, if someone's got a severed artery and you've got this sort of pattern and a lot of blood, then you're looking at a very serious crime. Okay, whoops, that's my last slide. So be happy to take questions on that afterwards. Thank you very much.
Right. I was very fortunate to start a career in molecular biology many years ago and just happened to be, if you like, in the right place in the right time when Alec Jeffreys from Leicester University invented genetic fingerprinting, DNA fingerprinting in the mid-1980s. And in fact, although you're aware that it has been very much underpinning a lot of forensic science from then on over the last 25 years, it also played into things like paternity and immigration, relationship, family analysis, also plays into animal relationships and so on and so forth. And I joined ICI, a company now that hardly exists at all, but at the time it worked with Alec Jeffreys to use these technologies. And there you see on the patterns on the left-hand side, as you're looking at it, these are real-life genetic fingerprints. And in fact, this is an evidence from a mock case, but where the center profile there, that strip of bands in the middle, is looking to be sought to be matched to one of the 7 DNA fingerprint patterns either side of it. And actually, you can see to do a DNA analysis at that level is very easy because it's very clearly the one position just to the right of it. But in fact, that technique needed a blood stain of about a 50p size. It took several weeks to generate that sort of data. And in fact, the less DNA you had, the longer and longer it took. And sometimes we'd be waiting 6 weeks or so to get a DNA result. And of course, the police were tremendously excited about this technology. And of course, that sort of time wait would be impossible. And of course, it wouldn't really feature in TV stories today. What we're using now in the laboratory in 2012 in the UK is an analysis that generates a pattern like this, and that is called a DNA profile. We don't use fingerprinting as a term nowadays. And you can see, in fact, there are 10 sets of spikes which represent fragments of DNA, and then there's an extra 11th one here, which perhaps at the front you can see have an X and a Y, and that's a sex-determining test for the sample in use. Well, do these relate at all? Was Alec Jeffreys' invention completely moved on from? No, in fact, what Alec had discovered back in the mid-1980s, that amongst your 3,000 million DNA bases that code for you as individual, there are elements of it which are repetitive. Like stuttering, if you like, in your genetic code. And he initially found some which we could use radioactive chemistry to detect at the time, and that was part of the process that meant it took such a long time to expose the results from trace amounts of DNA. But also at about the same time, in the mid-1980s, a US scientist called Kary Mullis invented a way of copying DNA. It was called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, and all of a sudden you could work with a very trace amount of DNA, and this sort of genetic photocopier could give you a copy of the DNA within a few hours. But that to work had to look at a different size of repeating sequence that's in your DNA. And the power of repeating sequence in your DNA is that at one location it might stutter just a little bit. So you have an example here of 9 and 10. So that's a DNA fragment with 9 repeats of that particular genetic element of your sequence. And the person's, of course, you have 2 copies of all your DNA, and in the second one, here's 10. So that person is a 9-10. Let me make that hopefully a little clearer for you, because people often are very concerned about if the police have your DNA, what do they know about you in it, what is being revealed in that DNA profile. And what is happening then is if you look at the DNA from your nucleus, and if you could unravel it all out, you've got 2 copies, 3 billion bases long. We're looking actually at very small little elements of it where the sequence goes into a stutter, where in this example here it goes ATTG, ATTG. And in this mock individual, there are 6 repeats of that reframe in that bit of the genetic code and 3 there. And if we were to cut out that DNA or analyze it using the technique of PCR, we generate fragments which move along a grade depending how many repeats they've got. So that 6-3 pattern becomes a peak here at the 6 position and the 3 position. And that's what you saw in the last slide. So there are 10 of these separate analyses looking at repeating sequence that happens to be in your DNA. It's not linked to any to any gene information. It's in the non-coding information that makes up the vast majority of your DNA. But when you get all these 10 DNA types, we now enter that as a simple numerical code. So your DNA profile is actually along here down the bottom. So what goes into the DNA database for you as an individual database, and these are made-up numbers, this doesn't represent anybody in reality. You have the XY for a male, or it would be XX if it's a female sample. and then they're coded in a specific way going the way through. But say if that first test, this one here, 3, 6, will go in there 3, 6, and the next test might be a type 16, type 18, the next test a type 10, type 12, and so on and so forth. So it's just a numerical code. So when that goes submitted to your database, into the database, it would be run against the suspects or other suspects or other crime scenes and so on and so forth. It's a simple numerical comparison. So you're looking for a match to that number. There are a lot of scenarios around that, a lot of variations in that, which I could sort of probably follow up later on in questions.
Hi, my name is Clea Koff. I am, like our chair here, a forensic anthropologist, and she kindly left it to me to explain what it is that we do. We essentially identify unidentified human remains by applying tenets of physical anthropology to the human skeleton in order to determine age at death, sex, stature, ancestry, pathology, and trauma, which relates to cause of death. We can do this in part because our bones record some of our lives every day, whether we like it or not. And if we meet a violent death, and that involves bony trauma, our bones will record that as well. Because of the capabilities of forensic anthropologists to interpret these marks on bone, we often work with the police to assist in cases of homicide, suicides, accidents as well, of course, any time when there is an unidentified body at the center of a case, or perhaps one where trauma has affected bone and requires our expertise. We also assist in dealing with mass fatalities. And there are just forensic anthropologists who spend their entire careers working on identifying the remains of service people who died during previous wars. We also work in the area of human rights abuse investigations. I was involved in working on cases of war crimes, collecting evidence of war crimes on behalf of the United Nations International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia. Those courts are attempting to hold leaders accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity in those countries for atrocities that were committed in the 1990s. Essentially, the trials that take place are large-scale murder investigations because, of course, war crimes include grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. That may include willful killing, which is murder in a time of war. It may include torture or willfully causing great suffering. Naturally, when a murder trial is involved, forensic scientists may be called in to provide forensic evidence. It seems quite straightforward now, but in 1995, when those of us who were called to the first team received that call, it really was unheard of. This sort of international team had never been brought together. And we were given a rather clear mandate. We needed to locate clandestine graves related to indictments that the tribunal had for particular crimes. We had to exhume the bodies interred within. Then we had to establish the demographics of the graves, how many men, women, and children, for example, their ages and so forth. But importantly, we needed to know how these people were killed. Were they fighting when they were killed? Because if they were non-combatants, then we're getting into the area of war crimes and crimes against humanity, because civilians or even soldiers who aren't fighting are protected by the laws of war and other international humanitarian instruments. It might sound kind of straightforward, locate clandestine graves, but of course people have gone to great effort to actually hide these large mass graves. For example, at this particular site in eastern Croatia, we didn't have to use satellite imagery, which we've had to use in other places, looking at areas where large amounts of vegetation have been disturbed, or we didn't have to come in with a probe to look for any depressions. We were able to actually use witness testimony to try and find this grave near Vukovar. There was one man who was one of 300 people taken from the Vukovar hospital in November of 1991 who described jumping off of a lorry that was making its way up a track next to a creek. He was on the lorry with about 30 other people after being beaten in a nearby building. He feared for his life, jumped off, and began to run away through this creek. As he was running away, he said that he heard gunshots. This was part of the evidence, the suggestion that a crime had been committed, because those 300 people from the Vukovar hospital were never seen again. When the United Nations first sent investigators to this area in 1992, they found bullet scars on the trees here. They found some bones on the surface of the ground, some jewelry. There was a suggestion that there was a grave. The team was actually basically sent away at gunpoint by the local authorities at the time. The grave was protected, and then we were able to arrive at the site 5 years later as another forensic team, starting with this first effort of actually beginning to exhume the grave. We start with using heavy earth-moving machinery. What you actually see here is just thin layers of soil being taken off the grave at each pass of the backhoe. We have an archaeologist who's spotting the backhoe, as we call it, looking for changes in the color of the soil, the consistency of the soil, looking for the disturbance. I'm standing there as an anthropologist spotting for human remains. We obviously aren't going to lift any human remains with the backhoe, and the backhoe drivers are very skilled in feeling how the change in the soil is happening, but we're actually watching closely here. But we can't take the time to actually dig a grave by hand from the beginning, especially when there's only about 4 or 5 people on the team, and you have about 2 months to do this before the snow starts falling. We quickly move into using hand tools, cleaning the surface of the grave. We now have human remains actually visible. This is the first boot with a foot inside of it that is beginning to stick up out of the surface of the earth. We're cleaning the soil. We're attempting to find the edges of the grave because we don't want to have to move all the earth in this entire area. We then, at this particular site, began to pull soil off the entire surface of the grave. You can't just go into a mass grave and start exhuming each body as you find it. In part, you need to understand the entire grave, but also the bodies are actually entangled with one another, and a lot of times there's bodies going into the wall of the grave. You might have thought that you'd found the edge, but actually the bodies continue past it. So we were working backwards there to pull the soil off. Eventually, we exposed almost the entire top layer of this grave, which eventually yielded 260, just over 260 people. I should mention that all but 8 of these people have been identified, and all of their names were on the list of the 300 who are missing from the Vukovar hospital. But this is actually just the second stage of what the tribunal has asked us to do. We now have to exhume these bodies. We have to isolate each body. We're photo-documenting, doing electronic mapping. We're doing preliminary anthropological analysis, and of course collecting and preserving evidence as we go through. The remains are then taken to what is usually a temporary mortuary. In this case, this is actually in Western Rwanda, and we had an inflatable tent. We didn't have running water. We had generators providing water and electricity and so on. Something we may talk about later is how can forensic science function in areas where we don't have electricity, because it's a post-conflict setting. Here you're seeing an anthropologist and a pathologist working side by side. That's how we function. The anthropologists are providing age, sex, stature, and so on. The pathologist is conducting autopsies where possible, determining cause and manner of death. We're working together on cause of death, particularly because a lot of the work in the war crimes setting is in the reconstruction of skulls. In Rwanda, during the genocide of 1994, I think it's well known that almost everybody died from sharp force or blunt force trauma to the head. So those skulls, and from the grave that we were working in Western Rwanda, there were more than 100 children in that grave. If you envision children being hit over the head with machetes, eventually when the tissue decomposes from the skull is going to be in pieces that need to be brought back together. In Bosnia and the graves around Srebrenica, in addition to the bodies still having wrists around their wrists wrapped in wire behind their backs and blindfolds on their heads, we were looking at an average of 30 projectiles being recovered from the bodies. So high velocity rifles were used to kill people who were definitely non-combatants, regardless of whatever else they were in life. That high velocity weaponry causes great damage to the skull. The forensic anthropologist's role here, more so than anyone else on the team, is to examine all of those skull fragments and put them together, a bit like the David Attenborough puzzle of the egg that you'll see outside here in the foyer. We have to put those together in order to find the nature of the trauma, to be able to describe it. For gunshot wounds, we need to know where the entry and exit wounds are. We need to know the trajectory of those bullets. We need to know if people were shot from behind. We need to know if people's arms were raised when they were shot. We need to coordinate this against the clothing and so on. All of this goes to that final part of the mandate for the tribunal, which is, how were these people killed? Was a crime even committed? Because we've got forensic anthropologists in the field, though, we also have the opportunity to attempt to identify these bodies. In Rwanda, you're seeing here a photograph from Kibuye, which is western Rwanda. It's very challenging to identify the dead because, of course, the way you identify the dead is by gathering information from the living about the people that they are missing. And during a genocide, usually most of the extended family members are also killed. It's very hard to find people to give you that information. It's not like what we have in a situation here. We have a missing person. We've got a lot of people who may be able to provide information. In this case, what you're seeing here is actually people who believe that they may have had a relative in this particular grave were invited to come to look at clothing which had been removed from some of the bodies. There were only a few survivors of this particular massacre and a few more relatives who could come and have a look at this clothing. But what you're seeing here is actually a huge departure for what most forensic anthropologists deal with. And I'm speaking as somebody who's working in the United States. In the United States, we work on behalf of the coroner's office or law enforcement. We do an examination at a morgue. We may take remains back to our laboratories. We then produce a report. We give this to the coroner. The coroner gives it to a medical investigator. That medical investigator then makes the next of kin death notification. We do not come out of the laboratory and meet anyone. We don't talk to anybody face-to-face in general. So here, for me, this was a very important day in my life. And I say my life because it's more than just what it means for me as a scientist. To stand with people who are related to the bodies that we had exhumed from the grave shifted my perspective about what forensic anthropology is and who we work for. I have been fascinated by bones, by the science. When I say bones, I mean bones themselves, not Tempe Brennan on television. She wasn't around at that stage. But I felt that I was working in service of the dead. What you realize when you're working directly with families who are related to those bodies is that you are actually working in service of the living. That was the first shift that happened for me. The next shift was that I realized that the unidentified dead are missing persons. They're missing persons who have been found but remained unidentified. I don't know if that sounds kind of earth-shattering to you, but for me this was a big deal because in general, missing persons are handled by police, unidentified bodies are handled by pathologists and anthropologists. Sometimes it's never the twain shall meet, which is why we have 40,000 unidentified bodies, or probably more than that, long-term in the United States, bodies that may never be identified through DNA analysis. I decided that with this new perspective that I had gained from being with relatives of the dead, I had to do something about this. I initially founded a nonprofit to do what I call forensic profiles of missing persons. That's taking forensic anthropologists like we were here to actually interview families of the missing. In part, we're trying to take the load off of law enforcement, but in part, we have special skills. We know how someone's life may have been recorded on their bones if someone simply describes their relative's life to us. Then I did the most logical thing I could think of to do next, which was I wrote a mystery novel all about this problem. Because in fiction, I could actually explore the big question, the big context of human identification. That goes for the living as well, because the living relate to the dead. We have to understand how the living identify themselves so that we can identify the dead. And in fiction, I could also kind of make things happen the way I'd like to see them happen. It took a long time, though, to get the book published, but the time gave me an opportunity to see the value of putting forensic science into fiction. And I think what it is, this is sort of an evolving thought, I think it's that we get to visualize the science that we hope for. It's certainly the science that these people hope for. People hope for something more most of the time we can provide. Excuse me. I've been traveling and I get a little bit emotional sometimes when I'm tired. But we also can visualize the forensic scientists we'd like to be. That's my sort of road into fiction. I'm very curious to hear our next speakers talk about her road into fiction.
Thank you. Thank you. I listened to that and I'm profoundly grateful that I get to just make it up and not actually have to deal with these realities on a daily basis. For me, as a writer of crime fiction, at the heart of what I do is write about people, write about characters, write about relationships, and write about what happens to people when sudden violent death walks into their lives. None of us is prepared for sudden violent death. We may have read all sorts of books, true crime, crime fiction. We may have watched all sorts of things on television, documentaries, crime series, but nothing actually prepares you for the reality. And when I'm writing a crime novel, one of the things I'm trying to do is to give a simulacrum of what it's like when people lose someone, and a simulacrum of what an investigation is like, the kind of processes that people have to go through to get the answers to the questions that are being asked by scenes like this. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. I've always been fascinated by science. I was lucky enough to be educated in Scotland at a time when we had a breadth of curriculum that allowed me to do my final exams in science and arts. I have higher in English, French, Latin, maths, physics and chemistry. And I was always fascinated by the questions raised in the science class, how things worked, why they do the things they do, why the physical properties of the world around us are the way they are, why chemicals react to each other the way they do. It always felt to me to be a kind of soluble magic, if you see. There was this extraordinary thing happening, and scientists could explain it to us. I mean, obviously there's a lot that they can't explain to us, but the great joy is that as time goes by, generally speaking, we learn more and more about the world around us and how it works. And that's always continued to fascinate me. When I started writing crime fiction, there wasn't a huge amount of forensic science around. Really, there was not much more than fingerprints. There were sort of vestigial things people would talk about. Maybe you could match hair of a type to one sort of type of person rather than an individual, stuff like that. So you didn't really have to know very much about science to write a decent crime novel. You could just busk it, really. You could have a shabby detective in a raincoat who drank too much and smoked too much and had a bad divorce somewhere in his history. Or you could maybe try to write something that felt a little more consonant with the life you actually lived, which is what I was trying to do in my early crime novels. But it very rapidly became clear to me in the late 1980s and the start of the 1990s that things were changing, and that increasingly what the scientists were learning in the laboratories was having a direct impact on what the police detectives ended up investigating in the field and what we ended up hearing in the courtroom. That science was taking up a whole new place in the role of service of justice. And that, to me, was a very exciting place to be at, and I felt that we were on the cusp of something really interesting happening. And so as the science developed, and as we got all sorts of things like the DNA technology, like the blood pattern analysis, all of these kind of things became at the service, if you like, of the crime writer. We could play with these things and use them to investigate crimes in ways we'd never written about before. And that's where I think the real problem began for crime writers, both writers who write for television and writers who write books, is that we did get a bit carried away by the magic. We did think you could get a DNA analysis in 23 minutes. And I'm sure you've all at one time or another watched CSI, and even those of us who are not scientists sit there going, I don't believe that. And what I've always tried to do as a writer is to stay within the bounds of authenticity, to write in a way that the scientists actually feel, okay, yeah, maybe that's how it could go. But also in a way that the reader feels entertained and maybe even sometimes informed by it. My job primarily is to entertain the reader, to draw them into my world, to make them care about the people in this book, to make them want to know what happens. People sometimes ask me, how do you write suspense? Where does suspense come from? Every single time suspense comes from characters. It comes because we care about the characters. We want to know what happens to them. You might on the surface say the suspense is coming from finding out the next piece of information. But that only matters because we care about the impact it's going to have on the lives that I'm writing about as a writer. In the same way that all of this science means nothing until it's applied to the lives of the people who are affected by it. Because sudden violent death doesn't just affect the person who's dead, it affects all the people in their life. It affects their family, their lovers. It affects their friends. It affects the police officers who are called out to the case. It affects the journalists who are reporting on the case. It affects the scientists who are dealing with the evidence. All of these lives are touched by sudden violent death. And writing about that as an entertainment, if you like, I am always conscious of the need to give the appropriate weight to the lives of victims. For me, it's not enough just to have disposable people who can be introduced into the plot simply in order to be murdered and cast aside. For me, it's important that the reader cares about what's happening to everybody who peoples my books. And so sometimes the people who end up dead in my books are not necessarily the people you might expect to end up dead. They're the kind of person that you think is actually the hero or the heroine of this book. And I think that's important too. Because when sudden violent death comes, it doesn't come where you expect it. By its very nature, it is a surprise, it is a shock. It's the nobody saw that coming moment. Sorry about this. But at the heart of that also, I have to reflect the real world. I have to reflect the world of science. I have to reflect what's going on around me. The danger for someone like me is falling in love with the technology. It's exciting. You know, I sit down with people like these and they tell me stuff. They tell me all sorts of stuff, extraordinary things, that make me go, that's just incredible. They tell me things that you think, that can't be right, surely. You know, my friend Professor Sue Black at Dundee, the forensic anthropologist, and Sue has for many years been extraordinarily helpful to me as a writer. And one of the great gifts that Sue has is explaining scientific stuff in language that people like me can understand. I remember I once called her up and said, what would a body look like after it had been in a peat bog for 200 years? And she thought for a moment and she said, a big leather bag with a face on. And I mean, that was just a brilliant image. You can all see that now, can't you? In your mind's eye, you can see that. And I used that line straight in the book because that was exactly, I couldn't think of anything more vivid than that. And one of the things that I remember Sue telling me recently, she's been working on the identification of people from photographs. People who commit offences, sexual offences against children, are smart enough not to have their face in the photograph. But what they don't realise, what they hadn't realised, is that your hand, the back of your hand, is as distinctive as your face. The vein patterns in your hand are as much yours as a fingerprint is. The vein patterns in your forearm are as much yours as a fingerprint is. And guys, I have to tell you that probably the vein patterns in your penis are as individual as a fingerprint. Now, when somebody sits and tells you that, you think, oh my God, there's got to be a short story, there's got to be a novel in this somewhere. You know, immediately your head's bursting with the possibilities. Another time I phoned Sue, we were talking about tattoos. And again, it was to do actually with the bog body. I was asking about how a tattoo would look after it had been in the bog on the body for 200 years. And she told me that one of the phenomenon to do with tattoos is that when you get a tattoo, the lymph nodes in your body nearest to the tattoo take up some of the ink. So that if you've got a tattoo on your arm, a red and green tattoo, in the lymph nodes in your armpit, there will be some red and green staining. So if you find a torso with the limbs cut off, because your murderer thinks, he's got distinctive tattoos, I'll just chop the arms and legs off, the lymph nodes are going to tell you, obviously not the picture on the tattoo, but they're going to tell you he had a tattoo on his right leg in red and blue ink, a tattoo on his right arm, red and green ink, all of those sort of things. And that's interesting enough in itself. But then I thought, so that means if you tattooed a body after death to try and make it look like somebody because the tattoos were so distinctive, there wouldn't be any dye in the lymph nodes. And that's the moment where the little bell goes off in my head and goes, bing, story. And so for me, I mean, I sometimes feel like a vampire, you know. I mean, I go around sucking all the information I can get from these people, you know. And it's not the big science that I get the stories out of. It's the wee bits and pieces that make it work in a book. I'm not here to give you a detailed breakdown of exactly how the science works. What I do in my books is to kind of tell you, this works, this is the answer, this this is what works. But what makes it come alive, what makes it feel authentic, is the small stuff. It's the details you tell me about what happened in the lab the day that you did X. It's the thing you tell me about something very weird that happened to one of your co-workers when you're doing an excavation. It's what you tell me about something odd in the DNA that led you down a new avenue that you hadn't explored before. Those are the things that make it human. And those are the things that I can put in that come back to what this is all about, which is about character. It's about people. It's about caring about people's lives. And ultimately, that's what all of this leads us back to. The science is not some dry stuff that's just out there because it's exciting to know stuff. It's important because it's actually about people's lives. It resolves some of the dark places in our lives, and it leads us to answers that tell us about people we've cared about and what's happened to them. And that's why what these guys do is important. And I like to think that some of the stuff that what me and my colleagues do is also important, because we never lose sight of the human dimension, or what we do doesn't work. These guys don't often get to tell you about the human dimension of their work, but that's also what really matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those. Thank you for your fascinating snippets into your work, but also for keeping to time. Just before we start our discussion, I'd just like to sort of gauge the number of questions that we have so I can time things more appropriately. Could you raise your hand if you have a burning question? Oh, okay. Right, I think in light of that, we will have a bit more of a discussion and then open it to the floor in a moment. So I'd like to kick off with a general question, I suppose, one that we've, I think, touched on a bit. But could we say, why we think forensic science is so fascinating? What is it about it that captures our imagination so much? Who'd like to go first? Go on.
Okay. I sort of think that it's because a lot of the things that we deal with, murders and attempted murders and that sort of thing, is so far removed from normal life that it becomes almost it's fascinating. What must go through somebody's head to do something like that? And then when you get to see that there's quite interesting science that goes into solving the crime, I think those two factors make it quite an interesting topic.
I also think sometimes that we have a desire, if not for justice when something's gone horribly wrong, then some people might have a desire for retribution or revenge, and it can actually come, in a sense, through science as opposed to in some other inappropriate way that involves another crime. And I think we have this desire, even if it's a fictional crime that's been created, we have this desire that somebody figure out what happened to solve that, and we may or may not be learning something along the way, but we feel that something has come full circle, and that this person didn't get away with this crime, and the victim isn't forgotten. But this may be a more sort of subtle thing that's happening on a subconscious level when we absorb all these programs and books that we enjoy so much. It's not because we're always looking for something dark, or we're looking to get to the end, let's say, of the book, because we want to know, as you were saying, Val, what happened.
I think ultimately we're looking for the answers of why people do the things they do to each other, and how we can stop these things happening, how we can intervene before these kind of things happen. Now, in order to try to do that, we have to understand why these things happen. And I think in order to understand why these things happen, we need to sit down with the people who perpetrate these terrible things and find out what they think happened, find out what went wrong in their lives. The forensic psychologist, Gwen Adshead, who's head of therapy at Broadmoor, talks about the people who come into Broadmoor as people who come in like victims of a disaster, but they are the disaster in their own lives. And I think to find out how people end up as the disaster in their own lives, we have to find out why they do the things they do. And the first step on that journey is discovering who these people are. And I think one of the great fascinations of forensic science is that it can deliver to us the perpetrators. And that's the first step on the journey to understanding why these things happen within our society, and maybe to understanding how we can stop them happening, or how we can make them less toxic to us.
So you don't think it's, maybe it's a very cynical view of mine, but you don't think it's that we are interested in seeing if the system is possible to beat, if there is a perfect crime out there that couldn't be investigated, couldn't be solved?
The perfect crime is the one that nobody thinks is a crime.
Okay.
The perfect crime is the one where no suspicion arises. You know, it's the elderly relative who's a bit frail who falls down the stairs and breaks their neck. Sorry, I don't mean to give anyone ideas here. It's the poisonous plant you eat by mistake. It's the crimes that don't look like a crime that are the perfect murder.
I was just going to say, I mean, one of the realities, often if you're interested in science, you get to a point to some extent where you're either fortunate enough, I guess, to carry on in a career in academic research, which often may have little current application, or you move into a field where your science is going to be applied. And I mean, applying DNA science or some of the chemical analysis to forensic situations is a very exciting, real dynamic application. But actually, of course, the same science could be applied in a clinical setting and a variety of other settings. So I think it's just certain individuals get attracted to an application that takes them into forensic science. They may not be wanting there to necessarily solve the crime of the century. It's just applying their knowledge in a useful way.
So do you think a lot of people get into forensic science almost by accident? You know, they are biologists or chemists or physical anthropologists or entomologists, and then suddenly their expertise is needed by the court, and they can then tack forensic on the front of their expertise because they've been used at court.
Well, I have to put my hand up and say I got into it accidentally in the sense that I was involved very much with some fundamental cancer research and how radiation damaged DNA, and could radiation actually kill cancers, you know, that sort of double-edged sword. And then all of a sudden the discovery of genetic fingerprinting came along, and I just transformed my thoughts about how this could be applied, and I was very fortunate to be involved with it then. But it was serendipity, really.
I'd say now, though, it's the other way. That people are always asking me, what degrees did I study in order to be a forensic scientist? It's like, that's the end game. What do I have to do to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm finding that with my students, is that more of them are having undergraduate degrees in forensic science rather, unfortunately, I think, than specialising in becoming experts in a particular field and then applying it to the forensic context.
Maybe my colleagues now are acting as a kind of recruitment service.
I was going to say, Anna, that I think I've noticed that as well with students, you know, the younger generation of students. There's been an interest in forensic science much sooner, particularly, especially for forensic anthropology. There's a real tunnel vision towards forensic anthropology. When one has to remember the anthropology part of it, it's important to understand things about culture and about people, because we are looking at the physical traces of human behavior, and we have to understand people. And when you do get involved in working with missing persons, their families, the relatives of victims of crime, you obviously need some of this other understanding to be, I think, a well-rounded scientist. But one of the things I noticed when I was in graduate school is that for forensic anthropologists who are actually training in a morgue or mortuary setting where we're actually handling real cases for the police, immediately, people who are not able to eventually come to handle the smell of a decomposing body or dealing with fresh cases that you're actually, obviously there's plenty of blood and all the things that you'd expect from someone who just died earlier in the day, but you are having to actually get down to bone in order to retrieve your samples. Those people just go and find something else to do. I'm not really sure how the rest of us all adjusted to these things, but we did. And then we end up being the ones who are in there. And I don't know if that is changing as undergraduates now are coming into forensic science and not having an opportunity to actually do practical work in the morgue and the mortuary. So those people may be in for a terrible shock one day, or they'll find out that it's actually, you know, okay with them, because you see things that you are never going to forget. And nor would you want to.
My employer did it in quite a clever way and had everyone in the first week go to a special post-mortem, and everyone still standing at the end carried on with their training.
Do you think that that the new generation of people wanting to be forensic scientists, do you think their expectations are coloured by the popular culture, the TV, the books, the films, and therefore, do you think they're in for a shock?
Yes.
Okay, right.
Well, there's also, because there's a mundane aspect to a lot of our work at times. I mean, there's a huge amount of repetition in the sort of examinations that we do. You know, the bodies are always dead. You know, that doesn't change. You know, there's a lot of things that, you know, there are there's a lot of housekeeping, there's a lot of report writing, and I mean, maybe I haven't watched CSI enough. I don't know. I think that it goes to like a music track, and a lot of things happen.
Once is enough.
But I think that may cause things. But I also wonder sometimes, do we really believe what we see on TV? You know, did we think George Clooney could actually do those surgeries on ER? I mean, should we really be believing what we see? These are stories they're stories that are being told, as you were describing, to entertain in part. I don't think that those programs are designed to train.
You hear stories now about juries who say not guilty on the basis of there was no forensic evidence, because it's on the belief that in the CSI effect, as they're calling it, that there must be evidence. It's, you know, Locard's principle, but taken to the extreme. If every contact leaves a trace, then there must be forensic evidence at the scene. And unfortunately, that's not the reality, because it depends on whether or not it was collected. You know, if it was collected and then retained improperly, then it may not be there. And there's so many other facets that come into it. So I think that's a key point about the effect of what we're seeing on television.
I mean, I feel very conscious of trying not to glamorize the whole business of the investigation of murder. So I try not to make either the forensic scientists or the police detectives look particularly glamorous and exciting in terms of their lives and their lifestyles. But I know that that isn't the case for everybody doing the kind of stuff I do. And it's particularly the case with television, which does make everything look much more glossy and glamorous. And even somebody as messed up as Tony Hill can look quite glamorous in Wire in the Blood, you know. And I look at that sometimes and I think, no, it's really not like that. But I think there is a sort of duty, I think, on writers to try to be, I was saying, to be authentic, not to make it some sort of amazing sort of, you know, I'm going to look at this crime scene and I'm going to tell you everything there is to know about this killer and everything that happened here. And that's the kind of thing that I think does give people false expectations of what being a forensic scientist is. I get a lot of people coming up to me and saying, you know, I'm going to be a forensic scientist, and you know, they're sort of like usually about 18, and I sort of suggest to them gently that they might like to go and do something proper first. But then I think I'm sounding like my mother, you know, who said, I want to be a writer. Well, go and get a proper job. You need something to fall back on. If you're going to be a forensic scientist, you need something to fall back on.
Paul, do you think that with the advances in DNA, now DNA is seen as the panacea of, you know, and if there isn't DNA evidence or if it's compromised in some way, then, you know, then the conviction can't be made?
I mean, it is interesting that, well, I'm not sure what the actual statistic is, but let's say 50% of casework, particularly serious crime, there's a DNA element to the evidence in court. And I think it's very important that people tend to hypothesize, okay, that the police observe a particular DNA match between a suspect and a crime scene. And what DNA is telling you, who, you know, in a sense, that's your DNA there. It doesn't say how it got there, when it got there, why it got there. And that's for the broader scene of crime, crime scene specialists and so on and so forth to take that forward. And although the science of particularly DNA has moved forward to now where we will get DNA patterns from invisible stains, if that makes sense, but if we know that somebody walked out of a room and must have opened the doorknob, we can swab the doorknob even though there's no obvious sign of anything on the doorknob. We will get a DNA profile. So there's a pattern for an individual on that doorknob. It doesn't mean they created the crime in the room. They may have been a very incident bystander who walked through the door the day before or something like that, and their pattern is still residual because the person who committed the crime wore a glove or something. Those sort of scenarios have got to be worked through, but the absence of a DNA match may, yes, sort of say, well, why isn't it there? And yes, the DNA science can't do everything, but what it can do is say who was there, but not the other aspects of the crime.
Is there a flip side to that, that you can get DNA from these very small traces, very slight traces? Does that therefore make it easier to kind of fit somebody up, as it were, to make it look as if they were at a place where a crime was committed when they weren't in fact there?
Oh, I mean, that's the classic,
no,
classic crime
before
scene.
it had to be something fairly big, like you had to somehow find a fingerprint or you know, a hair or something. But now, really, it's just if the DNA trace is, as it were, so invisible, all you've got to do is maybe leave, you know, like an item of clothing that they've touched there.
I think actually a very intelligent criminal who really understood DNA science would certainly challenge the forensic scientists to interpret the profiles that are, of course, not just taken from the one doorknob. They would be taken from all the obvious places thought through by the crime scene examiners. But in fact, it's amazing how non-intelligent most of the criminals are. And you can see people who are robbing a smoke-free company and they've left cigarette butts on the floor, and that's an obvious thing not to do in that sense, and so on and so forth.
In a lot of occasions as well, they are the ones who call the police to say they've committed the crime. And we still have to then conduct a forensic examination after that in case they change the plea. That's actually, it happens quite a lot in homicides. They're the people who call and say, I've just killed my wife. And then the police arrive and they say, no comment. But you did just call us.
So maybe they should watch a bit more telly.
Maybe they should. No, they shouldn't. They shouldn't. Definitely not.
Okay, I'd like to open the discussion to the floor now, and there's a burning question over there. Could you wait until a microphone comes to you and then stand up so everybody can hear you, please?
Yeah, the one thing, sorry. Because forensic science is a science, the problem that I see is that with the Damiola case, for instance, and other miscarriages of justice where forensic science has been used, the one thing that bothers me is that the interpretation of evidence. I mean, you don't need to be an intelligent criminal to understand that if, for instance, have a workplace and someone's been murdered, but I also work there, and then they could say, well, because they don't like my face, they can say, I murdered that person. But obviously I use the same rooms. Isn't the problem interpretation? Because I don't think it's not the job of forensic science to stop human beings. Human beings are different in many ways. But what do you say to a person who's been in prison for 15 years and 16 years for a rape they didn't commit or a murder they didn't commit, and they say, well, the forensic says you did it? What do you say to them?
Yeah, it's a very good question. One of the key points there is the interpretation of evidence, which actually falls the responsibility to the jury sooner than the forensic scientist. Forensic scientists, and I'm sure all of us, what we do at a crime scene is we recover the evidence that is physically there. And there's a level of interpretation that comes with the DNA analysis, attributing a DNA profile to a particular stain, for example. So I recover a blood stain, and then a DNA profile is raised. The DNA profile is linked to the blood stain. So then in my statement, I'll be writing the blood stain of this person was in this location at this crime scene. And that's what I'll be saying in a court of law. That's my evidence. There may be further interpretation I can put on that, for example, that the blood stain was airborne, or that it's part of a pattern. From that, you can infer that the person who left the blood stain must have been present with wet blood, or his wet blood present when that blood stain was deposited. And that's as far as I go in terms of interpretation. A jury will then look at my section of forensic evidence and then look at what the witnesses have said and every other element of that case, and then they'll go and deliberate and then come back with their verdict. So as long as the juries are impartial and follow what the judge is asking them to do, then that's their remit, and I find that my remit is to explain the evidence that's physically at the crime scene. I hope that answers your question.
You get situations like in the United States where people have been put in jail for 40 years. They've had the same evidence, and then they find out, well, it's not the forensics, it's the interpretation, because then you've got witnesses who will say something else. See, that's the problem. I find that with forensic evidence, it's the orthodoxy. Like, for instance, the women who have been accused of killing their kid, only to find out that the scientists who have different interpretations how those kids die. If that person's innocent, and and we find out that they're innocent of doing it, that's the problem. I mean, how do...
There's the entire... you're talking about situations which are... They're situated within the entire criminal justice system, and the sort of exonerations which have been taking place in the United States based on DNA evidence have also, of course, led people who do research in areas of criminal justice to try and understand how innocent people were convicted in the first place. Many times there may not have been any forensic evidence, or it was compromised. This has led to changes in law enforcement practices, criminal justice practices, and so on. And there's quite a long road to go on, because, of course, you have human beings involved in every aspect of the criminal justice system. You have fallibilities. We have fallibilities, within juries. I mean, we have ourselves. We have ourselves as human beings to deal with these things. And I think that the exonerations in the U.S. in particular, I have obviously heard of Damilola Taylor, but speaking of the exonerations in the U.S., I think that we're just at the beginning of recognizing the context in which those miscarriages of justice took place, and also how to compensate the people who were affected within it. And all of these things are cautionary tales, I think, for all of us who are working in the criminal justice system, even when we think that, we've evolved, and we're able to be impartial, or we're able to be objective. There's a lot of arguments amongst philosophers even about the capability of being objective in science, because we come in with a lot of other baggage, if you will.
But I think one of the things that is important about the way that forensic science has evolved in the last 20, 30 years is precisely these exonerations. A lot of the reasons why people end up being found guilty in a court of law are nothing, historically, back before we had as much access to forensic information as we have now, historically were for reasons of prejudice of one sort or another. And the science offers us the chance, if you like, to go back and correct some of those mistakes of interpretation, or sometimes mistakes of just blindness on the part of law enforcement, on the part of juries, on the part of lawyers. And so we haven't, I think the thing that maybe we should also be looking at this from is that those people are finally being exonerated. Yes, what has happened is a terrible thing, and we have to make it up to them in whatever way we can. But the good thing is that some exonerations are now taking place that 20 years ago would never have taken place.
I also think there is always the challenge of interpretation, particularly for the forensic scientists, because what they're seeing is remote, usually from the crime scene. It's being bagged up by the crime scene officers, and it comes in as individual items. You're not there at the heart of the crime scene with that particular analysis. This is a very dry, technical approach to, is there DNA there, is there isn't, is there drugs there, and so on and so forth. I mean, interesting, one of the things that is happening in science is sort of catching up with the media stories and presentation, that DNA currently, the sort of profiles I showed you earlier, currently take, well, they can be done in about 8 to 10 hours, but generally they take a day or so once the samples have got to the laboratory. But the technology is advancing very rapidly, and it will be soon that you can do it under an hour at the crime scene. And so all of a sudden you can see the science moving to actually interpreting in the context of the crime, that very rapid instant where, in fact, the criminal hasn't got time to wash their clothes and run away. You're in there, and you can eliminate or include far more rapidly. So, in fact, I think eventually forensic science will catch up with CSI. But it's still a way to go. But that's the sort of exciting potential. So that reduces, to some extent, interpretation, which is done, of course, remotely from the actual event.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think someone down here had their hand up first. Yeah. Stand up, please.
just a question. Do you, as a forensic scientist, do you ever put the case in front of the person? Meaning that, do you follow up? Do you have names for the persons you work with? For instance, you are given some sort of case, you file a report. Do you then, on your own, follow up on the court case to find out if somebody was convicted? Do you personalize the work, or is it mostly just lab reports and DNA tests?
Well, yeah, it's quite a good question, actually. The way we work in the lab is I'll report on a case and I'll have a group of assistants who work with me. And recently I walked in to find a newspaper cutting on my desk that one of the assistants had found in the Evening Standard, and so left it for me. I mean, that was, you know, it's unusual, but it was quite, I don't know, it makes it a lot more real when you start to see what you're working on in the paper. It's, yeah. So you do, but I don't personally seek it out, the information, and not really for any other reason that at any one time I can be working on between 10 and 20 cases, and they're all at different levels, and it's almost like as hard as you work during your working day, that there's never enough time. So yeah, when I'm in my personal time, I tend not to follow up on it so much, to answer your question honestly.
You'd never make a television series.
Sorry.
And for forensic anthropologists, and Anna, you could speak to this too. I mean, obviously, when you're working on a case, at that initial point of working on a case, you're not to know anything about the case because it could obviously color your examination. You have to, you know, examine this person's body, ideally in a vacuum from what is being said. In fact, if there are detectives present in the morgue, which they sometimes are, you know, they're not to be talking about other evidence and so on, because we're trying to understand what the body is telling us. I have had times when I've been startled to sort of, something's come across, either somebody sent me something about a case that we worked on, obviously in the war crimes, with war crimes tribunals. I don't seek it out, but I do find that when I am learning about trials that are taking place, it's not convictions, it's trials. It's actually just that moment when someone who thought that they had managed to pretty much get away with a crime because they were in total power, actually had to explain and defend themselves, talk about what they did. It's a place, the courtroom is a place that those people didn't expect to be. And when I think about the time that we spent at the scenes and the time we spent recovering the bodies, it's meaningful, but there isn't any sense of triumph. It's just a sense of this is a process that should happen. I think sometimes, I certainly have always, people suggest to me all the time, you need to let more of this stuff go. And I think that it could be quite dangerous maybe to look into anything further. But that would be an interesting thing to put into fiction.
There is a level of detachment that we need to cocoon ourselves in it, although there are many arguments against that. Yeah. There is a general core, I think, of having to detach ourselves slightly in order to be able to carry on with our jobs, so that we don't get so personally affected by it every day. You know, so, it wouldn't take very many days.
Up at the podium.
Well, and just to say that certainly in DNA evidence terms, where one has found evidence associating a suspect with rape or murder, actually the first time you will ever see that individual is when you go into the witness box on the day of the trial, and then you see him standing in the sort of the glass box or wherever it is in the court trial. So you have no idea, apart from a name, till the day of the case.
Who's next? There's a lady over there. Yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah, yes, since you're there, yeah.
Is there any evidence that the increased awareness of the scope of forensic science is having any impact on criminals in terms of their awareness that they're going to get found out, and therefore, is it worth doing it?
Who wants to take that?
It's an interesting question. I'd say it's a bit of a split, actually. Certainly, most of the crime scenes that I've attended have been sort of straightforward almost crimes of passion where there hasn't been any forethought. And that I would say is the most common thing. The exception to the rule is when you get, for example, the Night Stalker case, a criminal who's quite prolific and it goes over many years. And a lot of the reason that he continued to offend was because he was so forensically aware, wearing gloves, being sure never to leave things at a crime scene. So there's definitely an argument for it. Are you suggesting that we don't give you any trade secrets at all?
In the war crimes context, one of the things that we noticed after the initial exhumations in the mid-90s was that other sites in other countries of new executions, the bodies which had actually been interred in mass graves were then exhumed by the perpetrators, or people hired by the perpetrators, and then the bodies were burned. And of course, forensic anthropologists can still work with burned remains, even professionally cremated remains up to a point, not necessarily identification, but other markers. In Kosovo, there was a process of removing bodies from Kosovo altogether towards Belgrade. Later, those bodies actually were exhumed from behind the police stations where they were buried. The bodies that were put in lorries and then driven into rivers, of course, floated to the surface. I was dismayed initially to see these sorts of changes developing, because I thought that, you know, the other proposition you put forward, which is people think, well, it's not worth it. They would just stop using murder as some sort of political policy, was really the opposite. But in this effort to dig up and hide remains, of course, a lot more evidence was left behind. Plus, it was physical evidence of the knowledge that something criminal had happened here. There is no need to put legitimate victims of legal warfare into hidden graves. And of course, all those people who are used to exhume bodies, it's such a dirty job. You know, everybody talks about it. Those people were never paid enough. Some people sold their stories. Other people took photographs wondering what was in the back of these lorries. All those people became valuable witnesses along the way. So again, I always keep coming back to the fact that I think we're still evolving, and maybe we're too early, you know, in looking at this question. There's no way that we're not being affected by what we see is out there, but at the same time, as the other panelists have been saying, the techniques are also improving.
Yes, I would say actually it's a real sort of chase,
Yeah.
in the sense that as the criminal community gets wise to the latest forensic technique, they're trying to involve their practice. And so you see, obviously, in movies and things like that, where drugs will be dumped and tried to be flushed. And all that's done is driven the forensic scientists to have far more ability to detect drugs at a more trace level. And it's similarly with mobile phones and computers. You try and, you know, the criminal will try and delete their records so they're not linked up with others, or they delete the stuff in the database. Well, in fact, the clever computer forensic scientist, it's all there still. They can retrieve their data. So yes, it's an interesting interplay that probably will go on for time immemorial.
Okay, let's have the next one.
This is more of a directional question. Like, as was mentioned, like 80s was when DNA fingerprinting came into the fore and how it has developed now. So where do you actually see forensic science heading, like, from now? Like, you know, in which areas do you kind of foresee like a breakthrough of sorts, which can completely change things and which could completely, you know, say, to use, for use of a better word, revolutionize what we know about forensic science today?
Well, I heard a couple of interesting things the other day. It may sound completely science fiction, but I could see it happening. Flying robots in crime scenes instead of people. So you don't initially go in and do your assessment. You send in a little sort of 360 camera on the back of a remote control aeroplane, I suppose, and fly it around the rooms so you know what you're dealing with before you go in. And that would dramatically reduce the amount of traffic through that crime scene. And if you think about crime scenes and how many people must have to go in, as I said in my presentation, you've got the initial response officers, the homicide assessment team, and the crime scene manager gets there. You know, some of that you'll never remove because you have to make sure that the risk to life situation has been dealt with first of all, because it's primarily to save lives that the police officers go in. But after that point, it would be amazing to, if you think about it, have a little flying robot go around and download everything, and then you get it up on the screen, and then you start targeting what you need to do and when. Amazing. I think it could happen.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I would say definitely in the near reality, the drive to speed up analysis and bring it closer to the crime scene, to greatly more empower the crime scene officer to get a lot more information in that sort of golden hour post the crime, it's something that will happen, I think, in the near future. One more science fiction idea that may yet happen, we're all very much aware that dogs and so on and so forth have tremendous ability to distinguish individuals, even it's purported to detect cancers in individuals and so on and so forth. The human ear and the human nose, and in fact mechanical instrument noses at the moment just can't match dogs, and in fact I think bees are apparently even better than dogs. But it has been proposed that you could have a little sniffer device under every door, in every entranceway, and effectively we all have unique odours. Apparently even identical twins have distinct odours, unlike their DNA. So you could literally be tracking anybody and everybody in every room, everywhere, if there's a supercomputer somewhere that there's nothing to do.
Yeah. And on the back of that as well, using odour to detect. At the moment, it's quite arduous when you're looking for small blood stains on very dark items of clothing and shoes and things. So people are talking about either using nanotechnology or the odour sort of bee situation to actually smell blood stains on items.
And apparently odour persists for a really long time. So if someone's been in a place, I mean, we can't detect, but the odour sticks around for a long time. And I was listening, there was actually something on Radio 4 about this just the other week, which I was listening to because I was doing Pick of the Week. And the scientist on that was saying that you can freeze odour as well. You can take odour samples and put them in the freezer, and they've been demonstrated to last up to 8 years. Which is, like...
Well, dogs and trees. I mean...
Or maybe something that's maybe not so science fiction, although these are really happening. Maybe something that would revolutionise forensic science, as far as DNA would be concerned, is if there was a national database of DNA. And I don't think that's science fiction, but more maybe an ethical...
You mean every individual?
Oh, sorry, what did I say?
Just a national...
Oh, yes, yeah. But, everybody having their DNA profile uploaded to a database when they're born, that kind of thing would revolution. Obviously, they were
ethical.
Yes, yeah. But that kind of thing might revolutionise.
And they've always said, well, foreigners get away with murder.
Yeah.
I think the science fiction, unfortunately, in the United States would just be having a forensic anthropologist in every coroner's office.
Yeah.
We still have police officers in plenty of habitable parts of the United States who will say on the recovery of skeletonized remains that it's just bones, we can't even tell what sex it is. And trust me, it's easier with bones to tell somebody's sex or if they're intersex or so on. We don't have all of the variation that we have when we're alive. There are parts of the United States anyway, and I won't speak for the UK. In fact, I think in terms of human identification, there are some benefits for how it's handled here. Maybe because the volume has been slightly smaller per capita in terms of the homicide rate and the number of unidentified bodies. But it would be a dream to see more forensic anthropologists actually working to deal with the staggering load of unidentified bodies. And it doesn't require anything particularly high tech. Ideally, you would get to use DNA, but we have a lot of bodies which have already been cremated with no name. No samples were taken for DNA because nobody knew there was ever going to be a time that you could do that. And those people are left in the cold, and their families don't even know that this has happened, and they're still looking for them. And when you think about how hard it's been to actually see something like anthropologists in every morgue, that's why it begins to seem like science fiction that could happen.
Any more questions? Yes. This gentleman at the front.
We've already heard of juries refusing to convict because of a lack of forensic evidence. and of the possibilities of misinterpretation of forensic evidence. Are we reaching a point where the availability of the science is perhaps spoiling, or we're becoming too reliant on the science at the risk of losing more traditional investigative techniques?
Pass that on.
No, it's very true. Very true. I mean, we're frequently having to actually turn to our own sort of clients, the police, and say, I don't think that's actually going to bring anything to the case. Because you really have to stay away from it becoming a tick box situation where someone's investigating a crime and they say, forensics, have we got that? You know, and forensics doesn't apply, forensic science, to all scenes and all crimes. So yes, it's definitely something that we're aware of. And in terms of juries and the expectation, I agree. It's definitely something that we need to keep an eye on. But I'm not really sure, as a forensic scientist, how I can be in any way involved in that. But it's a very good point.
I've certainly seen.
No, go on.
I've certainly seen in my experience when I worked for the police that if anything, it was almost the other way round. But that was a while ago. But the policeman would come and say, "We know this guy did it. We know. We've just got to have some forensics to prove it," and that was really shocking. And I would distance myself from that as a forensic scientist. But that was certainly something that I came across.
But on the other side of that, something that has changed dramatically in recent years is police attention to interviewing technique. If you watch much television, the sort of stuff that you get in Waking the Dead of Trevor Eve yelling at people and the sort of bullying stuff that you see in a lot of television series just doesn't happen anymore. If you actually want to see what the kind of interrogatory techniques that are being used more and more by police, Scott and Bailey has been one of the best fictional or visual examples of where police interviewing techniques have gone, and they're training officers much more in sort of psychological techniques, in sort of sitting calmly and talking to people and talking them through what's happened rather than browbeating them through what's happened. And that's something that we're not necessarily conscious of, because in that particular area, the fiction lags well behind the reality.
I will say as well, though, forensic science can be used to bring into the interview room to get a conviction. I've had cases before where I've been requested for an urgent statement, and then 2 hours later, actually we've just interviewed him and he's pled guilty. Great for me, no statement, and also showing that forensic science has actually helped with that investigation, with the good old-fashioned police work. And in the case that I showed you earlier with the luminol and the shoe marks, that was basically solved with good old-fashioned police work based on Oyster cards. They followed the route of the victim, and he had a registered Oyster card. So they just looked at the next person to tap out after him. And they found that this person, even though it wasn't a registered Oyster card, they were able to trace it. And they followed his route, and he did the same thing every couple of weeks. And then they waited and saw who it was and arrested him, and he was wearing those shoes. So it's a brilliant tie of police work and forensics together.
I think also you mentioned the CSI effect earlier, and in the US, colleagues that I've worked with who work as consultants to help select juries actually will ask potential jurors if they watch CSI, because there's been such a long process in some trials where juries are like, but where's the evidence, or questioning the evidence and so on. And so there has been an attempt to try and select juries that have been less influenced by what seems to be, a type of television show which is somehow really going in deep for people. Something about it seems really believable. And despite the musical overlays. We sometimes put music on in the lab, but not so loud that nobody can speak.
Okay, we've got time for a few more. The gentleman over there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the talks. My question goes to the writer initially, regarding when you're kind of explaining these elaborate plans that people have made to cover up their crimes. Do you make a consideration whether you're giving people ideas? I know there's been some discussion, but do you ever stop yourself from kind of going down a sort of a storyline because you think it might kind of cause someone to act a particular way? And then also with regards to the previous points that have been raised about how the public's perception of science in the forensic context, do you think it affects the sort of personal responsibility that people have with regards to kind of the social elements of kind of crime fighting? So, for example, if I think there's a DNA test, I'm less likely to kind of be concerned with criminal activities in society because I think there's this sort of infallible protocol that can kind of pick it up. Therefore, it doesn't become a concern of mine anymore. And therefore, in some regard, morality, like the kind of moral behavior that kind of has developed over time, changes between us in society. And then also with regards to the DNA profiling. Sorry, I know it's a very quick question. Do you think that future generations will be less likely to have ethical problems with DNA profiling, the same way that it's being said that that the technology in society today is causing people through social media to be less concerned about their privacy? So as people become more scientifically aware in the future, and newer generations are growing up with technology and the kind of coolness of having my DNA profile, it becomes less of a problem. So thank you.
If I can remember what the first point was, I tend to write stuff that's in the public domain anyway. So I'm not writing anything really that somebody couldn't find out very readily if they wanted to. The thing I would say, I mean, there are two things regarding I think, yes, there is, I think the whole area of the moral responsibility of the artist is a very interesting and complex one. And I did actually write a novel called Killing the Shadows some years ago, which looks at precisely this sort of issue of how much responsibility you take for what happens with your work when it goes out into the wild. I don't have any sort of simple answers to that. What I would say is that in terms of deterrence, knowing that there are means of deterrence, knowing there's forensic science out there that can detect you, it's not really relevant in the overwhelming majority of homicides in this country. Most of the people who get killed in this country get killed in moments of drink and drugs and passion, and all the taboos fall away, and you stab your lover, or you stab your friend, or you get into a fight. Those are the kind of crimes that happen. And think you don't, when you're in a rage and you're drunk and your wife is driving you crazy, or your husband's driving you crazy, or your kid is screaming, you're not going to stand there and think, wait a minute, DNA is going to catch me out here. You're doing it, you're in the moment, you're not thinking about that. And in terms of the kind of crimes that are carefully planned ahead of time, those kind of criminals are always going to think about whatever the state of detection is at the point where they're planning the crime. They're not going to think about, obviously, future cases, future discoveries, because they don't know about future discoveries yet. And as far as the kind of crimes I write about, provoking other people to commit crimes, I don't really subscribe to that, because most of the kind of crimes I write about are the kind of sexual homicide that are provoked by like a hot button, a series of factors that come together and provoke an individual. And the chances of a real individual having those same trigger factors and them all coming together at one place in time are so infinitesimally small that I don't actually feel I've got a huge moral responsibility in that respect. And I don't know of a case. I can't think of a single case where it has been demonstrably shown that somebody has read something in a book and then gone and committed the murder because they read it in the book. They may have adapted a method that they read in a book, but they didn't commit the murder because they read it in a book. They were going to commit the murder anyway. It didn't. I mean, you're not going to read one of my books and think, "Hey, serial killing, good thing to do on a Saturday night." I think people do the things they do because they have their own reasons for doing them, and they will always try. In those very small cases, they'll always try not to get caught. because nobody does those things thinking, I want to get caught. So people will access what they can to stay out of jail, basically.
So your second question was about the morality of society, basically, and the fact that knowing that forensic science exists and DNA profiling in some way prevents people from acting. Is that summarised, your sort of question? Just making sure I'm answering the right question.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I would just say I'd hope that that's not the case. And it's more of a personal viewpoint that I think it is shocking somehow, especially like living in London, that you see people just sort of standing around when when someone's being mugged, and that sort of thing. I think is awful, and it is endemic. And I'm not sure if it has anything to do with the fact that they're thinking at the time, oh, it's okay, due process and forensic science will sort it out. I mean, they may be thinking that, but I'm a little bit of a cynic in that I'm thinking, oh, great, let's just, not be involved and look after myself sort of thing. I think that's more of a problem than people thinking that, because forensic science exists, that it'll be solved eventually, and so why involve myself? If anyone is thinking that, then don't, because forensic science isn't magic, unfortunately. So, yeah.
Well, just to top up the response, I think I showed you what a DNA profile looks like in practice. You can't see anything about the individual there, and probably you should be more worried about the information that's about you in your supermarket loyalty card, because it's amazing how accurate those free offers are that seem to target your particular interests. So somebody somewhere knows what your interests are on the data card, so to speak. In terms of being about you being out there, I think this is a generational thing. I'm not on Facebook. I don't like this idea of personally putting me about everywhere out there. But my daughter, who's at university now, yes, absolutely. It seems to be every second of her life is being clicked away and tweeted or what have you out there. And it's just, I would think in a generation's time, it would be just very common that you are out there and that's it. That's the way the world is.
Thank you very much. I think we have reached the end of our allotted time. I'd like to thank you for a very enjoyable and fascinating discussion and for all your fascinating questions. I'd just like to remind you that the exhibition is still open, I believe, and if you haven't already done so, please make sure that you have a look. And thank you very much.